Well, welcome this morning. We're back in Ephesians, and we're in a wonderful section of Ephesians, I have to say. I just love this section of Ephesians, so we'll come and take a look at that. In fact, this letter is a letter to the church in Ephesus, so it's really not any more cosmic than that in any sense. It's Paul trying to tell this church in Ephesus, which is actually in the present-day western Turkey coast, tell them, the ins and outs of what it is to live a Christian life. And remember the outline? Remember the outline? Can you do it with me? It's like this. There's 3 chapters in the beginning, there's 3 chapters at the end, and chapters 1, 2, and 3 tell us about stuff with our relationship with God, the doctrine about what that's all about. And these last 3 tell us about how to live the life this way. So it's kind of like a vertical and a horizontal. So we're in chapter 2, and I can't really do my fingers like that without offending you. So we're in chapter 2, so we're going to take a look at that. I really wanted to start us here, though, since this is Veterans Day, and this is actually a great lead-in into the whole chapter we're looking at. So when Veterans Day comes around, I remember many in our immediate family, in fact, who were veterans. My dad, Dorothy's dad, her uncle actually died in World War II. I mean, there's many people who paid a price. We never think about this. One of the curses of growing up, being born and raised in Maryland, is you know everything about the Revolutionary War and everything about the Civil War, because it happened right where you lived. This is actually a picture of General Lee's campaign into Maryland. So this is Maryland, where I grew up. This is, in fact, you probably recognize the name, the Battle of Antietam. Have you heard of that? Battle of Antietam. The South still, to this day, calls it the Battle of Sharpsburg, because it's in Sharpsburg, Maryland. But it's the Battle of Antietam is how we know it. And Antietam is the name of that creek in the picture right there is what it is. Antietam Creek. And this was, 1862. 150 years ago to this year, this battle happened. It's very famous because on that particular day, they set a record for the number of people to die in a single day in American history. And that record has never been broken. Happened on this day. By the end of that one day in mid-September of 1862, a little over 10,000 people died on the Confederate side, and 12,000 died on the Union side. So about 23,000 people died in a single day of fighting there. To this day, you can go to Sharpsburg, Maryland, and you can cross that bridge. Now it's just a highway bridge. It's not a stone bridge. And to this day, it's named after the general from the Union who crossed it with his army. That's what's happening right here. Burnside crossed that bridge. It's called Burnside's Bridge. And as I was growing up in Maryland and Boy Scouts, we'd go camping in different parts of Maryland and Virginia and West Virginia and stuff like that. We camped very close to Sharpsburg here, and we crossed Burnside's Bridge. But on that day, they massed together on both sides of the creek and killed 23,000 people. And all because they had an ideological difference, which sounds very strange in a sense, but there was an ideological difference that grew up in the young United States of America, that the South and the North just fell on different sides on this entire thing. Part of it was slavery, but part of it was economy. It was a lot of that. And because of this ideological distancing, there was a physical distancing of the North from the South. And so much so that even cousins and brothers were shooting at each other at Antietam that day. 23,000 of them died right there. Lee brought up his entire army. The entire army of the South was there. And McClellan from the North. Now, I'm digging out history I learned when I was back in junior high. McClellan from the North from Union Army brought only about 75% of his army. But there's nearly 150,000 people there in this tiny little town of Sharpsburg shooting at each other. And 23,000 died. What's that? I learned that in junior high. That's one of the curses of growing up on the East Coast and in Maryland, because this is really not too far from where I was born. Yeah. So here's the issue. A division rose up in our country, and that division led to war, led to a lack of peace. And as Paul comes into this section in Ephesians, we'll find out that there actually is a war going on as well between us and others, and we'll talk about that in a second. And that distancing that happened caused a lack of peace, and yet Jesus came around to change that and to fix that. I mean, if you were to take this picture right here and to repaint it in a peaceful context, what would that look like? It wouldn't look like people shooting at each other, but in the real sense, we talked about this a few weeks ago, the New Testament concept of peace is not the lack of conflict, it's the lack of division. Peace is bringing two things together in the New Testament context. And the only reason you can bring two things together is if they're not at odds with each other. See, so that's how it works. So in this picture, if you're going to repaint this picture for a peaceful context, you see that land between the two right there? There would be no division. These two groups of people would be together, and there would be no distance between them. So I want you to get that fixed in your mind first, because that's the New Testament idea of peace, actually is being one and being together. Lack of peace is being separated and distant and in conflict. Okay, so that's the concept we go into Ephesians today. Because remember, he started out chapter 2 by saying something about us before we knew Christ. He said, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins. And now he's going to amplify on exactly what that means in terms of our distancing, our division, and our anguish and our enmity. Okay, so that's where he's going to go today. So let's take a look at what he says, because this is just a great, hopeful message. Here's the outline. It's very simple. He's going to start with what life was like before Christ. Then he's going to talk about because of Christ, what happened. And then finally, life after Christ, what goes on after that encounter with Christ. And the distancing process and the peace. So we start with before Christ, and we jump right into verse 11 of chapter 2, if you're following along. He says this. He says, therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles, in the flesh, remember he's talking to these people who live in Ephesus in Turkey, very much not a Jewish community, Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed by the flesh by human hands. So he's saying that before you knew Christ, you were called the uncircumcision by the circumcision. So let's get back and find out what that's all about, because you read that and go, well, what? Here's what it's all about. If we go all the way back to Genesis 17, after Abraham has made his profession of faith, which was God counted as righteousness for him, in a couple chapters later in 17, God said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. And this is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And at this point, all the men in the crowd usually cross their legs kind of uncomfortably. This is the circumcision that goes on, male genitals, and it was done. It was actually it was a sign, is what it was. It was a sign of this covenant. It wasn't itself the covenant in that sense. It was an outward sign that something had gone on inside. We could talk at length about why this particular sign, this cutting, was significant. We're not going to go into that today, but just remember the fact that this was a sign that was given to Abraham's descendants, who became the Jews, right? Abraham's descendants, about their covenant with God that started with a promise that God made to Abraham. And so this was a sign in that sense. And so that's what he's talking about here. And he's saying there are some people who call themselves, so-called the circumcision, who call you the uncircumcision. So in that ancient world, usually if you were a Jew, you call yourself a member of the circumcision. If you were not a Jew, they would point at you and say you're an uncircumcised. And that's the way it works. There's part of that walk around with the covenant sign, and there's those that walk around ignorant and without the covenant sign. Okay? And even if the other society who was not Jewish, if they decided to go through this cutting of circumcision, it didn't make them a Jew. But this is the shorthand that they used for that kind of stuff. Look at this. Uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision. Now he's telling us something kind of subtle right here about the so-called circumcision. You know, if you come back to my picture of Antietam, you have the Union loyalists, these guys over here, who are committed to the fact that the Union of the United States cannot be broken. They don't want these guys to split off. So they call themselves Union Army. They're loyalists to that Union cause. And then you got these guys over here. And so the people who are for the Union point at them and say, you rebels, which means they want to break off and do their own thing. So the Union sympathizers, the ones who want to keep the Union whole, point to the rebellious people and call them, you are the rebels. Now, the rebs from the South wouldn't call themselves rebels. You know what they called themselves? Secessionists. We want to secede from the Union. But this is what I'm talking about. It's kind of this idea where the people who are in the Union point to the people who want to leave and call them, you are guys who are rebels. You're rebellion. You're rebellion to the cause. See, it's kind of like what he's talking here. Those are the circumcision. Well, it looks like this. The circumcision, which would be these guys right here, they look at the uncircumcised, which is these guys over here, and they shout at them, you uncircumcised. And so it's really almost a class prejudice is what it is. He would stand there over here and say, I'm part of the circumcision, which is I'm part of the Jews. I have this promise that started all the way back from Abraham. I'm genetically related all the way back to Abraham. I've got this sign. I'm of the circumcised caste. You over there, you are uncircumcised. You're the uncircumcised. See the idea? So it's really kind of a prejudicial sort of thing. I'm in the family of God, he would say, because I'm genetically connected. You're not of the family of God. I bear the mark of the promise, circumcision. You do not. You are outside, I am inside. That's exactly what he's saying. So the so-called circumcision, Paul's telling us that maybe they're not quite as inside as they think. Not quite as part of the promise as they think, even though they bear the mark of circumcision. That's what he's getting at right here. So-called circumcision, maybe they're not really circumcised. Well, there really is no debate about when someone's circumcised. It's easily checked, turns out. And in fact, it's a gambit that's used in the Old Testament during many battles to find out on whose side you're on. Circumcised. It's an easy thing to check, it turns out. But Paul's saying, so-called circumcised. Maybe there's a bigger issue going on about whether you're really a circumcised insider in the family of God. Maybe you're actually an outsider, but you don't really know it. The closest analog I could think of comes up in a picture here. But here's what Paul says later in Romans 2. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that which is what's of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. So Paul amplifies this through many of his later letters. He says, to be an insider with God, that is part of the circumcision, it's more of an inside issue than an outside issue. It's more than just the mark that makes you an insider with God. That's what he's getting at. You can't just put the mark on you and cut and think that that is going to do it. All the way through the Old and New Testament, it's really not about the outward things that you do like that, which make you, an insider with God. It's something much more fundamental about the heart. So which is why even in modern culture, modern Christianity, you can walk around, slapping on the outside of your life good things, good works, stuff you're supposed to do. Sure, I give to the poor. Sure, I volunteer. But inside your heart can be rotten. It's the same kind of thing. You can have the mark of circumcision, but you may not really be a child of God. See, that's what he's getting at right here. The so-called. This is the closest I could come to. Now, if you see someone who has a tattoo that's a cross, are they a Christian? Not necessarily. They bear the mark, but my question would be, let's talk about your heart. What is your heart? Is your heart really a follower of Jesus? Or is your heart someone that's been broken by the massive love of what Christ did on the cross? Or is the cross just a really cool thing to kind of tattoo? See what I'm saying? Circumcision had become this very same thing. Okay, so you have the mark of circumcision, but what about your heart? Is your heart really bent towards God? Or do you just bear the mark and think that because you bear the mark, I'm in with God? We do that now. I'm baptized, I bear the mark of baptism, so now I'm in with God. Well, no. It's still a heart issue. Always has been, starts here, ends here. Those things are outward reflections, but the heart's the issue. The heart's the issue. That's what he's getting at right here. So the uncircumcision is what the name they call on the people who are not in by the circumcision. So really what we have right here, we talked about division before as we started out. What we really have is a separation between the Jews and the Gentiles. You're separated from the Jews, and what is the thing that separates you? Circumcision. Or at least their presumption that they're circumcised and you're not. So there's this huge distance, and all through the Old Testament, coming up to the New Testament time with Jesus, the Jews stood off as superior and preferred and higher than all the rest of humanity. Because God chose us. He chose us so much that he gave us a mark to remind us that we are the chosen people. And they walked with their noses in the air largely, but without broken hearts. Without broken hearts. And this is really why when Jesus came along, they said, Messiah? I don't think so. After all, we're the chosen ones. We would be able to recognize when the Messiah comes. And then we're already in. We have no needs. Why do we need a Messiah? I mean, he can come in and clean house and push out the Romans. That'd be really nice as a king. But in terms of our need to be part of the family of God, well, no. I bear the mark, you see. And so it's an outward falsehood about whether the heart is actually circumcised. So this separation happens between the Jews and the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are always quick to say that the Jews are telling us that we're not like them. And so the Gentiles look at the Jews as holier than thou, and the Jews look at the Gentiles as being dogs. Literally, that's what they call them. So this separation happens because of this haughtiness of circumcision. He goes on and says, remember that you were at that time, well, you were separate from the Messiah. You were excluded from the commonwealth of Israel. And by the way, you were strangers to the covenant of promise. This is what it means to not be part of the Jewish community in a real sense. I mean, you understand the Messiah was coming from the Jews. That had been prophesied from way back. It was a theme in the Old Testament. If you're not a Jew, then the Messiah is not for you. That's what he's reminding them. You know, you'd stand outside the camp of Jews and say, sure, the Messiah is coming, but what's that good for me? He's going to be your king, not my king. See? You were excluded, actually alienated. Alienated is the real word, from the commonwealth of Israel, from the actual nation of Israel. You were pushed away. You were stiff-armed. You were alienated. You'd come into town and say, when are you going back to your people? When are you going home? Because this is not your people. You were alienated. You were never really citizens there. And also you were strangers to the covenant of promise. There was a promise that started through Abraham, a promise of blessing to that nation that would come from him and to the world. You were, when you were Gentiles, you were saying, well, I guess we're not part of that promise, are we? Because we're not a Jew. We're not of the circumcision. He says that's how you thought of yourself, and that's how the Jews reminded you were. Paul right here says, he even reinforces this in Romans 9, talking about his love for the Jews, which he is part of, Israelites, to whom belongs the adoption as sons, and the glory, that's the glory of who God is, and the covenants, like the promises, and the giving of the law, and the temple service, and the promises, who are the fathers, that is the promises that came to Abraham and the fathers of the faith, those promises, and from whom is the Messiah, according to the flesh, who is over all, God bless forever, amen. I realize it's a fragmental sentence, but go back and look. What Paul's saying is that the nation of Israel did have a preferred and different status from all the rest of the nations of the world. Not because they were better than the rest of the world, but because God chose to use them as a community to demonstrate his love for mankind. He wanted to say, here's a template community. What I'm calling all of humanity to is a community at the end of all the universe where I'm at its center and these people live with me and I live with them. I'm in the middle of them, they're with me. And I'm going to use Israel as a template to show you what that could look like. Not because they deserved it, but because God just said, I'm doing this. And so Israel was that. Israel was supposed to be a testimony to the world about what life with God can really be like. Really be like. You know, a friend of mine I met many years ago was a missionary in New Guinea. And I asked him, I said, you know, it's kind of politically incorrect these days to support Christian missionaries going into primitive cultures, who these primitive cultures, they're all happy and well-adjusted and they love their lives. And so why would we go in there and tell them that they're sinners and they need Jesus? We should just leave them alone and live their happy, tranquil lives out in the bush in New Guinea. Have you ever gotten that before, Neil? He says, oh yeah, I get that all the time. I get that all the time. But he says, you know, when people talk like that, they don't understand what life in New Guinea is like before Jesus. Life in New Guinea, he says, I started to understand the culture and the people. They woke up in fear. They lived their day in fear. They went to bed in fear. They feared for the spirits in the rocks. They feared for the spirits in the trees. They feared for the spirits in the water and the streams that was going to kill them. They feared for everything. And then they unconsciously gave to God, hoping that in some desperate move, you could take some of the most valuable things you have and sacrifice them to gods. And these gods would maybe keep you safe so tomorrow I wouldn't have to fear. But you know what? Every day they lived with fear. He says, that's not a tranquil lifestyle at all. They really needed Jesus to understand that he was sovereign. He was in control. He could watch out for them. He says the radical change in their life is just breathtaking. So really, he says, you were living in a lifestyle that was outside of the confidence and the peace you could have knowing that God would be the center of your community. When God's not the center of your community, it's not tranquil. It's fearful. Now, you know, you can extend that even to right now. You talk to people who live outside of Christ in different communities. Ask them what life is like on a daily basis. Well, I worry about this. I worry about this. I have anxiety about this. I take antidepressant drugs for this. All these things just kind of crash in on life. I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. I don't know whether there's really good reason to live. I don't know if there's hope. And there's fear. Because in life, you're out of control of a lot of things. And so you can fear and have anxiety. That's life outside of it. God said, that's not what I intended for life. I intended for life, through demonstrating it with the template of who Israel is, I want to demonstrate that you could have life with me where I would love you and provide for you and protect you and be everything you need. That was what Israel was supposed to be. By the time Israel got to the time of Jesus, they'd lost a lot of that. But if you dial the time back to times like during the times of David, for instance, when David was king, the nation, although David wasn't a perfect guy, he was a very sinful guy. David showed what life was like when you come back to God and say, God, left on my own, I'm just bring death and destruction. But life with you has hope. Life with you has provision and protection. That's why God had promised all the way through the entire Old Testament and into the New and into Revelation at the end, the contract simply is this: if you will be my people, I will be your God. This mutual dependence with him at the center. That's what he's always wanted. That's what Israel was supposed to display. But by the time we get to the time of Jesus, it's Israel puffed up and proud of the fact that they're in God's family because they have the mark. And that's not a circumcised heart. That's why Jesus had such a tough time when he came. You were strangers to all that. And as a result, having no hope and without God in the world. And I've been a believer for 40 years, and I really cannot imagine what life is without God anymore, without hope, without knowing that tomorrow is purposeful and not just an accident. That there really is something, there's a timeline that God has made. A psalm that I quote a lot, he says, the steps of a man are established by the Lord. That means that the step I take tomorrow has already been prescribed. It's like he's taking chalk and he's drawn on the ground. And he says, step here. I go, okay. Step here. Okay. They've already been established. He knows where they are. That's just a whole different idea to me that I can't even conceive of living a life where tomorrow is absolutely random chance and without purpose and without hope. I can sort of imagine it, but when I think back to Neil's description of the New Guinea natives who didn't know Christ, I can start to imagine what life like that is like. No hope without God. So when bad things happen in your life, no hope. There's no reason to believe that anything will ever get any better. There's no reason to believe that anyone ever loves you. I mean, there's really no reason to live except for the short-term, small things day by day you hope make life purposeful. And in the end of life, you find they're not. Jesus came to bring life and bring it abundantly. But he says to them, you were excluded and alienated from the nation of Israel, this nation wherein God wanted to live in the midst and bless them and show the world what life was like with God. And you were excluded from that. You were alienated. You were stiff-armed from that. You were out in the middle of nowhere over there in Ephesus, without hope, without God. Do you remember that, he's saying to them? Do you remember what life was like way back then? Hopeless. Galatians says this is what life was like. However, at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. Slaves to those things which by nature are no gods. You think you're free, but actually you're enslaved to things that aren't even God. I mean, things that don't even care about your end disposition. They don't love you, but you are enslaved to them. I think that's the most radical, fundamental nature of life without God, is it looks like it's a life of freedom. He says it's actually a life of enslavement. And from this side of being with Christ, I see that. I can understand that. There was a way in which there were so many things that I chased after that they actually enslaved me. And I'm thinking, well, I'm free to choose them or not to choose them, but actually you're less free than you think you are. Those things enslave you. Jesus said to the Pharisees in John 8, I think it was, he says, listen, if you sin, you're a slave to sin. Oh, I don't think so. I can stop anytime. That's the talk of an addict who's addicted to sin. Or cross out sin and put the word self. I'm an addict who's addicted to self. And that's life without God. Finding yourself, finding fulfillment in yourself, and finding that yourself has nothing to offer to yourself. except sin and destruction and selfishness that leads to that. He says, that's what your life was like, remember? Remember that? Can you think back to that? He says, people in Ephesus. Yeah, I can remember that. So not only are we separated from the Jews, we're separated from God because we're separated from the Messiah. I mean, we're just out in the middle of this barren wilderness without hope, without God in the world. And now, if that was depressing, because of Christ. But now, in the Messiah Jesus, this promised one of Jesus, you who formerly were far off have been brought near. I love those words. You who were far off have been brought near. Well, look at this. And it all done by the blood of Christ. It wasn't something you accomplished. It's something that he did. See these words far off right here? I looked back in the Bible to find out where that word far off is used so I could get a better understanding. And you can do this when you study the Bible. There's some very simple books you can get. How is this word in the Greek used in other places? You know the best place I found? You know this story. The prodigal son. Luke 15:20. So the prodigal son, he got up, came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Distance between the son and the father. Remember I said peace is bringing that distance small so it's together? There was no peace for him as long as he was separated from the father. And even while he was a long way off, he was far separated from the father still. The father saw him and ran to him. And that's our condition before Christ. Far off from God himself. And then right here, this word brought near, I'm going to show you two pictures, okay? This is like a Rorschach test, ink blot test. Tell me which of these two pictures solves the problem of being far. Now, when you're far and you need to be near, you can do it one of two ways. You can just walk from the farness to the nearness, or someone can bring you. Which of these two pictures is that passage? The second one. Why? Because you were brought near. You hear the fact that it's not a matter of you hiking closer to God. It's a matter that someone brought you to him. So yeah, it has nothing to do with that. You have been brought near, and what is the thing, like in this picture with this fireman, what is the thing that we've been slung over the shoulder of and brought close to? What is it? The blood of Christ. The blood of Christ has done that. When you were distant and far, and you knew you were distant and far, and there was nothing you could do to achieve nearness, he died for you, and his blood brought you near. This is incredible. This is incredible. He's got the full armor of God on, yeah. I like that picture because that's that fireman's carry. When I was in Boy Scouts, they taught us how to do the fireman's carry. So if any of you drop, on the floor right here, I can pick you up and carry you out the door. Well, I don't know. My back's hurting today, but fireman's carry. So here's the question that this verse begs in verse 13. Brought near to what? What are we brought near to, or to whom? All we know that there's a distance, and peace is a matter of shortening that distance. What is it? Who is it we're brought near? Okay, now, I've already told you we're separated from two things right now. We're separated from the Jews because they think they got it and we don't. And we're separated from God. So which of these two is he talking about here in terms of being brought near? Don't say it, just vote in your head right now. You could actually write it on an imaginary slip of paper and stick it in your pocket for a second. Okay? Which one are we brought near? He'll tell us. After Christ, here we go. Verse 14. He himself is our peace. Now we're going to get started here. Remember, peace is the changing of the farness to the nearness, unifying in that sense, no distance. He is our bringing closeness. That's what peace means. Christ is that, and we already know that. He told us in his blood, who made both groups into one. Wait a second. The only two groups we've been talking about right here is the Jews and the Gentiles. So it looks like it's the Jews and Gentiles. We've been made into one group, is what he's saying. So if you just voted for separation from God, you're wrong. Well, not totally. You'll see in a second. He's talking principally right now, the distance between you and the Jews as being Gentile, has been brought to nothing. You've been brought to be in one. But now wait a second. The Jews are going to like the fact, Paul, that you're telling me that I am now kind of part and in unity with the Jews, because they're very actively saying, nay, us circumcised say you are uncircumcised. So Paul, I'm not sure they're going to like hearing that we're actually one group. And he knows that, who made both groups into one, and he broke down the barrier, the dividing wall. Wait a second. You mean there was a wall between us Gentiles and the Jews? What kind of dividing wall? Actually, to this day, the Jews have dividing walls. If you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Wailing Wall where they pray, there's a dividing wall between those who go to the wall and those who stay away from the wall, and from the men and from the women. I mean, they're literally walls. So they don't intermingle, that kind of stuff. But he's saying that there's a wall that has always separated the Gentiles from the Jews, and that through Jesus, the blood of Jesus, that wall has been taken away. Well, what's the wall that's been keeping us apart? He's going to tell us. Here we go. This wall right here keeps these two apart and has continually separated them, made them two camps, made them wag their fingers at each other, say bad things about each other, just like at the Battle of Antietam. No. See? And there's something in between that's caused that to happen. But Christ got rid of that dividing wall and brought those two into one. Now that's an amazing thing, because we're talking about racial hatred that's gone on for generations. What is it possibly? I mean, let's get real for a second. What is possible that God, through Christ, could do so that these two groups that have generationally hated each other would become one? How is that possible? How is that possible? He's going to tell us. Watch this. By abolishing in his flesh, that's a sacrifice through his death, the enmity, that's the hatred. Excuse me. By abolishing in his flesh this hatred, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances. What's the wall that separates us? The law. This Moses' law that says this is how you do good, this is how you avoid evil. This is do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this, which the Jews have used as a wall, a dividing wall to separate them from the rest of the world that does not obey the laws of God. So wait, if that's the wall, then is Jesus abolishing the wall of the law of Moses that allows the Jews to wag their finger at us? Well, sort of. I mean, stay with him here for a second. Here's the wall. The law of commandments and ordinances, that is the wall. And that's the wall that the Jews always used to separate themselves from the rest of the world. We are keepers of the law of Moses. You Gentiles, you over there in Ephesus and Turkey, Asia Minor, they call this time, you are so ignorant about what it takes to be righteous. We have the law. We obey the law. You are ignorant of the law, and you're barbarians. See the distancing between the two? All because the law, which was a good statement from God about what righteous living looks like when God's involved, they used that as a way to elevate and distance themselves from the rest of the world, and even judge the rest of the world. And now somehow Jesus has removed that barrier. Oh, just hold on. You'll see how he does it. It's really cool. So that he himself might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. Remember, peace is the distance thing going away? He's made the Gentiles and the Jews one man instead of two groups. Generational fighting between these two has suddenly been erased through Christ. Now, how is it? We got to get practical. How is it that through what Christ did, these two groups who hated each other because of the wrong thinking about the law and righteousness, and we're good, you're bad, we're good, you're bad. How did Christ erase that? So now they both say, that's an old way of thinking. Galatians 5, Paul says to these guys, by the way, I'm quoting Galatians a lot because Ephesus is in the general area of Galatians, it turns out. So he writes this later. In the Messiah, Jesus, there's neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith working through love. Circumcision means nothing anymore. As a mark, as an outward physical mark and a cutting, it means nothing. So the Jews, as they stood in their circumcision and said, we're preferred because we have the mark, Paul is saying to the Galatians, speaking as a guy with the mark, doesn't make any difference anymore. Whether you're marked as a Jew or not marked as a Jew has absolutely nothing to do anymore with your standing with God. Never did, really. It was really a reflection of an inward giving to God. But the outward mark, nothing. So Paul says, so forget it. Forget the whole circumcised, uncircumcised thing. What does matter? Always has since the beginning of time. What matters? He says at the end of this, faith working through love. Now, Paul has this incredible argument he makes in Romans 4. He says, now think about this. Think about this. You who think the mark of circumcision is so important and makes you so righteous and holy before God. How about the father of the nation of Israel? Who was that? Abraham. God proclaimed him righteous? Yes. Because what did he do? He had faith. And it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And then Paul does the coup de grace. He says, and you know what? Was Abraham circumcised when God called him righteous? No. That came 2 chapters later in Genesis. So those of you who are trusting in the outward, physical mark, as though that makes you righteous, it didn't make Abraham righteous because it didn't exist yet. What made Abraham righteous? Faith. Faith. And on that basis, Paul makes his entire argument in Romans. His entire argument has nothing to do with the external marking. God isn't actually going to check you when you come to heaven and say, let's see it. He's not. He knows the nature of your heart. That's what needs to be circumcised. That's what needs to be marked and given to him. Paul says, all those guys who strut around thinking circumcision is getting them something, tell them no. Even for your father Abraham, it wasn't. It was faith. And so throughout the New Testament, it's said many times from John the Baptist, from Jesus, from Paul, and from Peter, they'll say, you know what? The mark doesn't mean anything. John the Baptist, I love this scene. Got to make a movie about this. I love this scene when the Pharisees come out to him where he's baptized out in the desert next to the water right there in the Jordan River. And he says, you Pharisees, who warned you about this destruction that's going to come? He says, you know what? If God wants to make sons of Abraham, children of Abraham, he can make these rocks into children of Abraham. I don't care about what you guys have marks on your body to make you children of Abraham. It doesn't do it. God can turn these rocks into that. So the marks mean nothing. It means nothing. And if you're banking on your eternity with God based on some kind of external mark or external genealogy or any of that kind of stuff, you can just forget it, because the issue that God's going to look at isn't the mark, isn't the genealogy, isn't your family. It's faith. Because that's what worked with Abraham. And so Paul will go on and write in Romans and also in Galatians later, he'll say, who are the true sons of Abraham? The ones with the mark? The ones with the right blood? The ones who were approved by God on the same basis as Abraham through faith? Yes. So he says, now there's like a new age here. Those who demonstrate the same faith in God as Abraham did are really the true sons of Israel. What? Now, you know how well that goes down in the Jewish camp? Really badly. That's not good news. Because we're the preferred people. They're not the preferred people. We have the mark. They don't have the mark. I mean, are you telling us that we're not preferred? Not if your heart's not circumcised through faith. No, you're not. And the big surprise to the Jews then, and for all eternity, will be that they banked on their genealogy and their mark and thought that that made God happy. And he says, no, it's the circumcised heart that makes a difference. It's given to me. That's what Paul is saying right here. And it's turned these two guys into the same kind. And verse 16, and he might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross. Well, wait a second. Now, wait a second. Those of you who voted for coming near to God instead of coming near to the Jews, it's this too. Because look at what he says. Reconcile. Reconcile is a word that we use when couples are in the midst of separation and divorce, and then they get back together again. So because of the events in their life, they're distant. And then when we reconcile, we come close again. We reconcile. So he's saying right here that not only were we distant from the Jews who uppity thought they were the right guys, but we have been distanced from God, and we need to be reconciled. So separation from God was a problem for you, that he might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross. So here's what he's saying. This is the good news. We are distanced from God, but the Jews are just as distanced as we are. And we both, as one kind of man, not two different kinds of men, as one kind of man, need to be brought near to God. And how? Through the cross. The Jews need the salvation through the cross as much as the Gentiles do. Now that, what I just said, that took a while for the apostles to get straight when you read Acts. They just did not, wait a second, isn't the Messiah from the Jews? Isn't his death and resurrection for us Jews? How can this be for the Gentiles? Well, because the Jews don't have any real preferential treatment from God. They don't have any inside track already. They need the cross as much as the Gentiles do. So he reconciles us to God in one body, as one person, not two different classes of people, as one person through the cross. And by it, having put to death the enmity, the hatred that's going on. So there's actually two planes of distancing and hatred and enmity that's happening right here. There's a distancing between the Jews and the Gentiles, wrongly so, because the Jews thought that they were privileged because of the law. But then there's the distancing between both of them in God. On the Pharisee side, on the Jewish side, because they thought they were already in, but they actually were very distant and very far. On the other side, the Gentiles, because they're just pagans, distanced. But really the situation isn't like that. These two people have the same need for the cross. The same need. Reconciled to God. So actually, the dividing line is vertical. It's above us, between us and God. It's not really between us and the Jews, because they don't really have any special place in that sense. So here's what happens. Watch this incredibly involved graphic. I'll just read this again and do this. That he might reconcile them both in one body to God, reconcile us to God through the cross, and by it, having put to death the enmity, the hatred, the distancing that happens. So what happens is what Jesus does is he comes on the cross, he separates this law which has always kept us from God, and then together in one body, he brings both Jew and Gentile to God. And the Jews have no advantage over the Gentiles. Because from the very beginning, winded all the way back to Abraham, from the very beginning, God said, I will be a blessing to your descendants so that you will be a blessing to all mankind. The plan was for everybody, Jew and Gentile, to be reconciled to God. Starting with the Jew as a demonstration, but not limited to the Jew, for all mankind. And the cross is what makes all mankind one person rather than two camps. See that? Now this is very good news to the Ephesians, because they've always thought that as pagans and as Gentiles out in this remote area of Turkey and stuff like that, that they never really were included as part of anything that Jesus could bring. How can we be? Because he's the Messiah of the Jews, and we're not Jews. And Paul comes there saying, no. The Jews have no inherent advantage. They were God's experimental kingdom in that sense to demonstrate who he was, but you've always been included, all the way back to Abraham, because he was a blessing to you Ephesians as well. You who were so far from God have been brought near through the cross. Do that. Yeah.
And wasn't it true that Abraham was Chaldean to begin with? He was an outsider to begin with.
He had the wrong blood to start with. He was a Chaldean. So yeah, he had everything going against him. He had nothing right. And yet the father of the nation found acceptance for the same reason that we find acceptance, through faith in Christ. It's the cross that does that. Yeah, Larry. God so loved the world. Yeah. He didn't say God so loved the Jews, and maybe you'll think about the Gentiles. But it was his strategy to demonstrate through the Jews. And I don't want to diminish that, because they were supposed to be the ones who would show this radical society and culture that depended on God as its center. They did something very odd in the nation of Israel that God was trying to teach the whole world about. They had a Sabbath day. Why is that so odd? If you know anything about agrarian culture, if you skip one day in your fields, all hell can break loose. I mean, it might be so bad, in fact, that if you skip one day in tending to your fields, that'll be the one day that the locusts come and eat everything that you've been working on for months to harvest and feed your family over the winter months, and you guys are going to be starving. I got to stay out there and be diligent, because if I don't protect my crops, my family will starve. It's all about me, and it's all on my shoulders. That's the agrarian mindset. But God said, take a day off. Well, if I take a day off, who's going to watch the field? Who's going to water my crops? Who's going to make sure the pests get taken out? Who's going to do all the stuff? You're going to have to trust me for that on your day off. And on your day off, you're going to have to stop worrying about it. And you're going to have to say to your soul, you know what? God's taking care of that. I'm okay. I'm going to take a day off. Oh my gosh. God has given me a day off in the week, and he has promised he'll take care of everything and it'll be okay. Now, take that idea and you amplify it by the fact that they had an entire year of Sabbath. They took off a whole year. And I can see the fathers in the households who are so good at growing crops and, well, wait, God, if I take a year off, my family will starve. If I don't plant, I don't sow, I don't reap, I don't kill the pests. If I don't do that, how can I know that my family is going to be served? How do I know they're not going to go starving? And God will say, me, I'll take care of you. And this is a way that God taught them that community with God at its center, he can provide and he can protect. And I mean, literally, he can do this. And he did this as a gift. Take a day off. I'll take it on Saturday. Okay? Okay. It was really a trust issue. That was very unusual in that part of the world at the time. That's why people would look in from the outside and say, can you believe it? Those Jews are taking another day off. And they're going to take all of next year off. They're all going to die. And they don't. And why? Because God takes care of them. That was God's whole design through Israel. So don't put that down. That was a pretty cool deal. And God promised to take care of them through all that. But as soon as by the time Jesus comes, their hearts turn away from dependence on God to dependence on the mark. And they've lost it. See, that's the deal. So Jesus comes and makes a way for both to go. So here's the summary of the entire thing. One big massive graphic, and this should make it clear. So he says, you were once far off and separated from God and from the Jews, far off in the corner, and you knew you were far off. You were far off and separated from the Jews because this line of the law, the requirement of what righteous living is like, the Jews used as a way to separate themselves from you and actually to call you names. And you were separated from them and separated from the life that God had promised to the community of the Jews, community with God as its center. You were separated from all that kind of stuff. But guess what? The line of that law doesn't really separate you from the Jews. It separates you from God. You're both separated from God. That's how it was. And Paul is speaking firsthand as a Jew, as the guy standing on the left. We were both separated from God. But Christ died on our behalf, thus making a way to God by taking care of the problem of the condemnation of the law. And then suddenly, and here's the magic, the guy on the left realizes in Christ that his own personal performance wasn't doing it. It was the performance of Christ that did it for him. So now he looks across at the guy on the other side of the screen and says, you know what? I have no privilege. I have no right standing with God based on what I do. I am more like you than I ever understood. And now as one man, as a single part of humanity, not a privileged left side and an unprivileged right side, he suddenly realizes I'm as much like the Gentiles as I never thought before. I'm in the same position separated from God. If that's the case, then now I can embrace those guys over there because we're really one and the same. We both are in need of Christ. And the wall, the barrier of separation that they used before to separate them from the Gentiles was gone. Because they both, in humility, needed Christ. And then through the cross, they both are reconciled to God. So the good news Paul tells the people in Ephesus is, you felt far away? Well, you were. And you were brought near to both the Jews and God himself through the blood of Christ. So that now, not as Jew and Gentile, but as one man, one kind of man, both in need of Christ, we can be reconciled with God. See, the key to having the Jews get away from this uppity, privileged nature was to be convicted of their own inability to earn their way to God. Just what they thought they had. And that's what also separated them from the Gentiles. But the minute they realized that I am hopeless as the far-off guys are, that I cannot earn my salvation from God, that I've got to drop all that pretense of my genealogy and of the markings and all that kind of stuff, I'm as helpless as the Gentiles to be in God's presence. As soon as you understand that, there's just not much that separates you from the people that are Gentiles. We're in the same boat. And there's one man, he brings us to him. That's what Paul is saying, I think almost in a personal sense, that happened in his heart. Remember, he was stopped on the road to Damascus, and he was out there actively collecting up Christians and bringing them in and had them go to trial and killing some of them because they were messing up the purity of Judaism. They were saying this guy Jesus is the Messiah. No, that's just going to wreck everything. We got to get rid of that stuff. So he went and he persecuted them. He says, we're the right people. We understand the way things are supposed to be. We are the experts in the law. These ne'er-do-well backwoodser kites who are saying that, oh my gosh, it's the Jesus guy's a Messiah. We got to take care of those guys and get rid of them because we're the pure ones. And it's our job to protect the pureness of our privileged status with God. And so he went after them. And then when God said, in that Damascus Road experience, why are you persecuting me? And Paul says, just be clear, and the me would be Jesus. Jesus, you're persecuting me. And then he suddenly realized, oh my gosh, this guy's the Messiah. And then this haughtiness that Paul had against the Jews and the Gentiles, or against the Gentiles and the Christians, that haughtiness went away because he realized that I'm in the same boat as the Gentiles. I'm in the same boat as these Christians who need Jesus, who need this Messiah. And then suddenly for Paul, the dividing wall of the law was no longer there, and there was peace with the Gentiles because we're both needy. See how that works? Anytime that there is, and this is a very practical application, anytime there's a division between you and somebody else, and if you just think for a second, who am I really distant from right now? I'm not talking physically, I'm talking emotionally, spiritually. And it manifests itself with you not wanting to be in the same room with them. So it's actually a physical distance too. But if you think of those people, what is it that distances you? I would guarantee you that 100% of the time it's because you're standing on the left side of the screen saying, well, I'm right, and they're wrong. And as soon as they realize they're wrong, we can bring this thing together. But until they come out and they tell me that they're wrong, and also say that I'm right, sorry. That separates us. And you know how you fix that? Exactly like this. You stand over here and you say, wait a second. I'm a sinner just like them. I have no privileged status because I do right and they do wrong. We both sin. And because of both of our sins, Christ looked at both of us, even me, righteous Jim. He looked at me and said, you're so unrighteous, I'm going to have to die for you. That's how unrighteous you are. And suddenly this haughtiness of who you are and pointing down to the person over there who's distant from you because you're so right and they're so wrong, you suddenly are humbled by the sacrifice of Christ. You say, you know what? I'm right down here with them. We are actually the same kind of person. And he forgave me. I can forgive them. I have no status privilege over them. And it's that thing. It's the sacrifice of Christ and our understanding in humility that we cannot earn his respect. We can't earn his love, that he gives it to us through grace because we're so unable to do it ourselves. That's what draws us in peace with other people. And that's how you break it. That's literally how you break those distance things in life as well. Yeah, Larry, you going to say? Yeah. Yeah, draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. It's out of James. And it's exactly right. The thing that actually brings mankind together is the sacrifice on Christ on both our behalves. That's what does it. I just went to a conference with, you've seen Todd Friel on TV 20s in the evenings and stuff like that. He did a conference down in Salt Lake City last month. And I went there to help interview him with Doris. But as I listened to his entire conference, it was a conference on how to live through conflicts in families. I thought, wow, this would be kind of cool. You know what he said probably 24 times during that day? what I just said right here. What distances us and our families is because we feel we are elevated and right and they are low and wrong. And yet when we come to understand in humility that Christ died for both of us, your elevation tends to go down to zero. And then you realize, oh my gosh, you're really kind of the same person. Let's get back together. He has sacrificed for both of us. And that's how you get back together. That's how it works. That's the nuts and bolts of how it works. So Paul says to the people in Ephesus, that's where you were. You were far, and now you're near. The Jews were far, and they will be near through Christ as well. That's how it works. I'm just going to close with this verse. This is remarkable, I think. At Pentecost, in Acts 2, Peter gets up and gives one of the most astonishing presentations to the collection of Jews who are in town for Pentecost for another reason. And they're curious because it's been 7 weeks since the death and resurrection of Jesus, and there's just a buzz about what happened. Who's this Jesus guy? And we heard rumors as we were gone that maybe he would have resurrected. Can't be, but is it true? So Peter gets up in this Pentecost presentation in Acts 2, and he does the entire presentation, gets down to the very end of the presentation, and said something that I consider prophetic because I don't think Peter even believed this when he said it. I think it was the Holy Spirit speaking through him. And you know what he said? This is one of the last things he said. For the promise is for you and your children and for all who are far off. That's code speak for Gentiles. As many as the Lord our God will call to himself. And that's what's so good about the good news, is those who feel like they are hopelessly far off from God. Peter says, this promise is for you and your children and for everybody who knows they're far off. And he'll bring you near to him, although he's gone. Isn't that cool? Now, I say Peter didn't probably really believe this when he said it, because God had to take him through a series of events in Acts later for him to finally get a hold of the fact that the Gentiles were in. But this was a promise that started right there at Pentecost. And you know what? Extends to where we stand right here. We who were all far off have been brought near to God through the blood of Christ. And as a result, there's nothing that separates us because we're all one man in need of the blood of Christ to reconcile us to God. No longer privilege, hierarchy, accomplishments, all in need of the blood of Christ. And that's what brings peace amongst the body and peace with God. And as soon as we forget that, I'm right, you're wrong, division, lack of peace. So next time you feel like you're distancing yourself from somebody because you're inherently right, remember Christ died for you because you really aren't inherently right. You're actually tragically stained by sin. Okay? This topic is so big, he's going to continue it next week. This is actually the first half of his thinking on this. But the good news is those who were far off were brought near. We've been far off. We were brought near. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this incredible truth. We were far off ones, farther off than the prodigal son. And yet while we were far off, you came running to us in Christ, like the prodigal son. Delighted and thrilled to be included in the promise that you gave, starting with Abraham and extended to all the nations. This promise of life in you, with you at the center, and with us dependent and loving and given to you as our God. God, I pray too, just from a practical level, that you would continue to remind us of our status when we distance ourselves from other people. It's not a holier than thou thing. It's not the fact that I, in any way, through any of the resources or capability I have made myself better or cleaner or more righteous and hence distanced and superior from anybody. But Lord, break our hearts in humility and remind us again of the terrible price that was paid on behalf of our supposed righteousness. Paid on our behalf for our sin through the blood of Christ, so that those who were far would be brought near. And Lord, speaking as one who was far, thanks for bringing me near. In Jesus' name, amen.